And in fact, as my previous speaker, I've been asked to talk about a topic that I'm terribly familiar with, that is international cooperation during conflict. I'll be using Sri Lanka as a case study of a conflict where international cooperation had a long-standing and important role to play, but where unfortunately it couldn't stop the complex humanitarian crisis that unfolded in the last year. In this talk of international cooperation during the Sri Lankan conflict, dreams and reality are mixed. And the dream is that the United Nations, which came into existence as a result of the most terrible war in history, will live up to the principles of its founding fathers, i.e. to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm the faith in the fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, the equal rights of men and women, and nations large and small. The changing nature of the conflict. First, let us briefly review how the nature and response to war has changed over the last century. In particular, the International Committee has developed various charters and principles to prevent and intervene to protect civilians, many of which underline how essential good cooperation is for an effective response. Subsequently, we will consider Sri Lanka as an example where these principles may have been applied and the responsibilities of various international actors. And this will be the focus of my talk in the subsequent thing. And recently that intrastate conflict has diminished and conflict within the countries have increased. And as we heard on the first day of this talk, Dr. Penderson alluded that most of the present conflicts, most of the people affected are civilians. I think the First World War about 5%, and I think recent conflicts about 95% of the people affected are civilians. And the role of the UN Security Council, the post-9/11 response, and the role of the various NGOs and civil society movements. And this is one of the most exciting slides, and you could see how that conflict within the countries have increased. Over the last 60 years, the conflicts have declined between the nations, but with a couple of notable exceptions. But interstate conflicts have been dramatically dominate the world political landscape. As Mary Calder from the London School of Economics described, these are new wars where significant feature is identity. Increasing number of conflicts confined to state boundaries have created new challenges for the international community, such as increasing number of internally displaced persons and refugees, and state perpetrating crime against their own citizens and terrorist threats. There has also been an increase in the number of actors responding to humanitarian emergencies related to conflict. This includes a dramatic increase in the number of NGOs during the 1980s, we heard earlier, more hands-on involvement of donors, and the military taking a more humanitarian role during the 1990s. This has inevitably raised challenges for good cooperation. As a result, the International Committee has been called upon firstly to deal with the humanitarian emergencies and secondly to handle violations of human rights and breaches of humanitarian law. Immediately after the Holocaust, Society of States established laws which were enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. In particular, the UN Charter declares the purpose of the UN to maintain international peace, security, and where necessary to collectively intervene. Moreover, it is the Security Council that has the responsibility to facilitate global agreement and to take prompt and effective action from the interruption of economic relations to the extreme of using military force. The ongoing domination of the Security Council by a few states presents problem of representation with potential consequences for collaboration. However, at no time has the United Nations Security Council authorized forcible intervention against a fully functioning sovereign state. An intervention without UN Security Council authority, for example, in the Middle East, remains controversial. Therefore, a group of liberal democratic states and non-governmental organizations attempted to build a consensus around the principles of the responsibility to protect. The responsibility to protect insists that states have primary responsibility for protecting their own citizens. However, if they are unwilling or unable to do so, the responsibility to end atrocities and mass killings is transferred to the wider international community. The responsibility to protect was adopted by the UN General Assembly in a formal declaration at the 2005 UN World Summit. Now, let us turn to the conflict and complex humanitarian crisis in Sri Lanka to see how these international guiding principles, including their emphasis on good cooperation, might be relevant and might be applied in reality. I'm sure that you all know Sri Lanka, but if you don't know, that's yep. Anybody has been to Sri Lanka?
It hasn't been.
Sri Lanka is formerly known as Ceylon, is an island in the Indian Ocean. It was colonized by the Dutch in 1505, followed by Portuguese and finally the British, who brought 3 kingdoms of different ethnic groups into one administrative unit. And then they centralized the administration in Colombo, which is the present capital of Sri Lanka. And there are 3 ethnic groups, and in the south are the Sinhalese, and in the south and the central part, and the Tamils, the native Tamils live in the northeast. And the British, when they introduced rubber and tea and so on, they brought hill country Tamil from southern states to settle there. So there are 2 groups of Tamil people, that natives, as well as who brought recently or 200 years ago by the British. And there are Muslims who are more concentrated in the eastern province, or they are also scattered. And both Muslims and Tamil speak Tamil as their mother tongue. And Muslim form 7%, and Sinhalese 80%, and the Tamils were 13% of the population. And you can see a brief history there. Following independence, political tensions between the ethnic Sinhalese and Tamils led to acts of violence. This is not the subject of today's discussion, but briefly, years of political and peaceful protests by the Tamils against loss of Tamil as a national language, burning of the Jaffna library with the 90,000 ancient manuscripts by state police, and violent pogrom against the Tamils in 56, 58, 77, 81, and 83 led to the predominance of the militant group, the Tamil Tigers, well known for their terrorist tactics in Sri Lanka and India. From 1983 till 2009, 26 years of war between the Tamil Tigers and the predominantly Sinhalese Sri Lankan army was waged in the northeast province of Sri Lanka, which is not accessible to the tourists.